When did someone see your worst and choose to stay? When my roommate Jack died from a fentanyl overdose, I tried to convince his mom he was still alive. While I was at work, Jack checked himself out of rehab and guzzled my NA's sponsor's drugs. A week later, his mom, Miss Rosemary, came through the door, talking about how proud she was that Jack was finally in rehab for 90 days. "I'm so glad he's getting better too," I heard myself say. You see, I needed her weekly payments that kept my landlord from evicting me since I couldn't afford Jack's half of the rent. Plus, 2 distribution charges from when I was 17 meant any drug-related incident would trigger an automatic life sentence. I forwarded fake messages from Jack about group therapy breakthroughs and meditation classes, while she cooked enough food to feed 3 people, always setting his place at the table like he might walk in. I maintained careful distance, and everything was going to plan until Kiara showed up. Kiara was Jack's 17-year-old sister who asked a lot of questions. "Why doesn't he ever call me back?" she asked, standing in my doorway uninvited. Even in rehab, they get phone time on weekends. I scrambled together elaborate lies about behavioral restrictions and therapeutic isolation. While we spoke, I saw how she'd scratch herself when she thought no one was looking, and the faded track marks under her cheap concealer. The following Thursday, Miss Rosemary was making Jack's favorite dish when Kiara excused herself to the bathroom. When over 20 minutes had passed, I already knew. I knew before I knocked, knew before I kicked the door open, knew before I saw her convulsing on my bathroom floor with foam on her lips. The Narcan I'd kept hidden since Jack died went up her nose while her mother screamed behind me. The same siren sounds filling the street, the same paramedics at the same address. At the hospital, Miss Rosemary collapsed completely. First Jack chooses drugs over family, now Kiara. She sobbed into my shoulder. My husband was right to abandon us. I'm losing everyone. I held this breaking woman whose son I'd helped kill while Kiara got her stomach pumped 1 room over. During the 72-hour psychiatric hold, I slept in waiting room chairs and learned Kiara had been buying from Jack's old dealer, trying to understand what pulled her brother away. "I wasn't trying to get high," she told me, her voice hollow as a grave. "I wanted to die where he died, on your bathroom floor. I thought maybe if I went the same way, I'd find him wherever he went. When I first started, I wanted to know what Jack thought was better than us," she continued. "But now I get it. It's not better. It's just easier than feeling empty." Something shifted after that. Miss Rosemary started coming daily, bringing food, but really checking on me. We developed new routines where she cooked while Kiara did homework at my kitchen table, and I helped with calculus problems. The routine held for exactly 30 days before Miss Rosemary walked in carrying a ceramic urn. She set it down on my table between the salt and pepper shakers and said, "Enough is enough. I've known for 6 weeks. I found the death certificate when I was getting Kiara's insurance information. Overdose, January 15th, the same night you called asking if Jack had any allergies to medication." The room went silent. Kiara stared at the urn with a blank stare while I waited for Miss Rosemary to destroy me with the truth. Instead, she unpacked containers from her bag, like nothing changed. "You think I don't recognize guilt?" she said. "The way you can't eat my cooking without looking sick. How you say Jack's name like it hurts your mouth. 3 months of Thursdays, and you've never once asked me for anything except recipes. Miss Rosemary, Suddenly she lunged at me for a hug while tears streamed down her face. "You called the ambulance. Dealers run. They don't call ambulances. They definitely don't do CPR until their ribs crack. The rehab, the relapses, the stealing from my purse. Those pills were just the last stop on a journey he'd been on for years. It's not your fault, but I still have to do this." Before I knew it, a needle was in my shoulder, and she was on her phone dialing 911, and I could hear every word she said to the operator about an overdose concern at my address, while the needle burned hot in my shoulder muscle. My legs started feeling weak and wobbly as she told them to hurry, that she was worried about someone who might be using again. Kiara just sat there staring at the ceramic urn on the table, not moving or speaking or even blinking, like she'd turned into stone. The burning spread down my arm, and I grabbed the counter to keep from falling while Miss Rosemary stayed on the phone, giving them details about the apartment number and which buzzer to press. Within minutes, those same sirens filled the street again, and I realized this was the 3rd time paramedics had come to this apartment in 4 months. The same crew from Kiara's overdose walked through my door, and the tall one actually shook his head when he saw me standing there. Miss Rosemary rushed over to them and started explaining that she gave me something to make sure I'd be okay, that she panicked when she thought about what happened to Jack. The paramedics moved fast, checking my pulse and blood pressure while asking what exactly she injected me with. She pulled an empty vial from her purse and showed them the label for vitamin B12, saying she read online it could help with withdrawal symptoms if someone was using again. My heart was racing so hard I could feel it in my throat, but they said the vitamin was harmless, just my adrenaline spiking from fear and surprise. 2 police officers showed up next for what they called a welfare check, taking notes about the injection and looking at the urn sitting between the salt and pepper shakers. Miss Rosemary told them calmly that her son died of an overdose, and she was worried about me because I'd been acting strange lately. The older officer introduced himself as Detective Porter Childress and said he'd need to speak with everyone separately about what happened here tonight. Childress pulled me aside to the hallway while the paramedics packed up their gear and started asking about Jack's last 24 hours before he died. I told him the truth about finding Jack on the bathroom floor after he stole from Brian's stash while I was at work, how I called 911 and did CPR until the ambulance came. Miss Rosemary sat with Kiara in the kitchen while we talked, both of them quiet as graves while the detective wrote everything down in his little notebook. After the police left with promises to follow up tomorrow, Miss Rosemary turned to me with tired eyes that looked older than when she'd walked in. She said she wouldn't pay next month's rent since Jack wasn't here anymore, but she'd keep bringing food if I promised to stop lying to her about everything. I nodded, because what else could I do, knowing Cooper Welsh would evict me within weeks once that rent came due. The next morning, Cooper had already posted a late rent notice on my door, even though it had only been 1 day since the first of the month. I called Brian to tell him everything that happened with the needle and the police and Miss Rosemary knowing the truth. He said I needed to come clean about everything and document it all for my own protection. His voice disappointed, but not surprised by any of it. Detective Childress showed up again 2 days later with more questions about the timeline of Jack's death and the fake rehab messages I'd been sending. I handed over my phone with all the made-up texts I'd sent Miss Rosemary about group therapy breakthroughs and meditation classes, feeling my stomach turn as he scrolled through months of lies. He mentioned possible charges for obstruction, but said that would depend on what else he found during his investigation. The next day, Layla Franco from Social Services knocked on the door to evaluate Kiara's living situation and mental health needs after the suicide attempt. She interviewed all 3 of us separately in different rooms, asking about family dynamics and support systems and warning signs we might have missed. After 2 hours of questions, she recommended an intensive outpatient program for Kiara, with daily check-ins and group therapy 3 times a week. Kiara agreed to the safety contract they wrote up together, signing her name at the bottom with a shaky hand. That same afternoon, Javier called from the restaurant to say I'd missed another shift, and if it happened again, I was fired for good. I tried explaining about the police and the hospital visits and everything falling apart, but he cut me off, saying everyone had problems, and his business couldn't run on excuses. My next shift was tomorrow morning, and I couldn't afford to lose this job on top of everything else crashing down. Miss Rosemary kept her promise about the food, showing up twice that week with containers of rice and beans and chicken that we ate in silence at the table. Kiara came with her both times, doing her homework while we ate, and not saying much about the outpatient program she'd started. The apartment felt different now without the lies filling up all the space, just 3 people trying to figure out how to move forward after everything broke apart. Detective Childress called the next morning asking me to come down to the station for more questions. My hand started shaking bad when he mentioned something about accessory charges if I'd helped hide evidence of Jack's death. Those 2 distribution charges from when I was 17 meant any drug-related conviction would trigger an automatic life sentence under the 3 strikes law. The detective kept pressing about the timeline and asking if I'd moved anything in the bathroom before calling 911. I told him I'd only tried CPR and waited for the ambulance, but he wrote everything down, like he didn't believe me. By the time I left the station, my shirt was soaked through with sweat, and I couldn't stop my hands from trembling. The next day, a woman named Whitney Schaefer from the public defender's office called saying she'd been assigned to my case. Her office was in this rundown building that smelled like old coffee and defeat, with stacks of files covering every surface. She told me to stop talking to anyone about the case without her present and handed me a yellow legal pad to write down everything that happened. She said cooperation might help avoid the worst charges, but I needed to be completely honest from now on. No more lies to anyone. I spent 3 hours in that cramped office writing out every detail while she took phone calls about other cases. Thursday came, and Miss Rosemary showed up with Kiara and containers of food like always. She set new boundaries right away, saying the dinners could only continue if I never lied to her again about anything. We ate mostly in silence with Kiara doing homework and me pushing rice around my plate. The food still made me feel sick with guilt, but I forced myself to swallow every bite because Miss Rosemary was watching. After they left, I found an official eviction notice taped to my door from Cooper Welsh, giving me 14 days to leave. The paper said I'd violated the lease by having police respond to the apartment multiple times. I started looking online for rooms, but everything required first and last month plus deposits I didn't have. The panic about being homeless fought with the fear about prison, and I couldn't focus on either problem. Brian called that night and pushed me to write out every detail of Jack's final week for my recovery work. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, remembering things I'd tried to forget, like how Jack had begged me for just a little bit to help with withdrawals. The writing felt like confession, but Brian said it was necessary for my recovery process. 3 days later, Detective Childress showed up at my door again, asking if I knew who sold Jack the fentanyl that killed him. I knew the dealer's nickname was Blue, but giving it up felt like crossing a line that could get me killed. Whitney had warned me about retaliation, but also said cooperation was my only chance to avoid serious charges. I told Childress I'd think about it, and he left his card with a reminder that obstruction was still a felony. While packing Jack's things into boxes for Miss Rosemary, I found a notebook wedged behind his dresser. The pages had dates and initials that matched Blue's pattern for tracking who owed him money. I stared at it for an hour before sliding it into the evidence bag Whitney had given me for anything I found. This choice might save me from prison or get me killed on the street, but I didn't have many options left. Kiara started her outpatient program that week and seemed to be taking it seriously. She had to check in with Layla every morning by phone and attend group therapy 3 times a week at the community center. Miss Rosemary drove her to every appointment and waited in the parking lot reading magazines. Meanwhile, Javier called to tell me he was cutting my hours in half at the restaurant. He said I was unreliable now, even though I hadn't missed another shift since that one time. I needed a second job, but between court dates and NA meetings, nobody would hire someone with pending charges. The money ran out faster than I expected, with lawyer fees and court costs eating up everything. Whitney called me back to her office to explain a possible plea deal the prosecutor was considering. She said obstruction could get reduced to a misdemeanor if I cooperated fully and completed a treatment program. It meant no prison, but months of supervision and random drug tests twice a week. I agreed before she even finished talking because anything was better than life in prison. The paperwork she handed me was 20 pages of requirements and restrictions that would control every part of my life for the next year. I signed everywhere she pointed without reading the fine print, because what choice did I have? Cooper knocked on my door that night with another notice saying I had 10 days left now. I showed him the boxes I'd packed and promised I'd be out on time, but he just shrugged and walked away. Miss Rosemary brought dinner again on Thursday, and we ate while Kiara worked on an essay about addiction for her English class. She read parts out loud about how it affects families, and I had to leave the table twice to throw up. Brian kept pushing me to share more at meetings, but I couldn't tell those strangers about letting Jack's mom believe he was alive. Whitney filed the paperwork for the plea deal and said we'd have a hearing date within 2 weeks if everything went through. She reminded me that any new charges or violations would void the deal immediately, and I'd face the original charges. I spent my nights searching for rooms on Craigslist and calling numbers from bulletin boards at the grocery store. Nothing came through, and Whitney called me the next morning saying we needed to move fast with the dealer information. I met her at her office downtown where the coffee maker was broken and everything smelled like old paper. She took the notebook I'd found behind Jack's dresser and flipped through the pages while making notes on a legal pad. Detective Childress showed up 20 minutes later, wearing the same wrinkled suit from before. I told him the dealer went by Blue and operated out of the park near the community center on Tuesday and Thursday nights. He nodded and said they'd been watching that area for months, but my notebook gave them the pattern they needed. Whitney made copies of everything while Childress asked me about specific dates and times from Jack's final weeks. My hands shook as I pointed out the entries that matched when Jack would disappear for hours. Childress thanked me and left with the evidence bag, while Whitney reminded me this cooperation would help my case. I didn't sleep that night or the next 2 nights, jumping at every car door slam and checking my locks constantly. My phone rang at 2 a.m. on the 3rd night, and Kiara's voice came through broken and desperate. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her, but I heard her say she wanted to use, and almost called her old connect. I sat up in bed and started talking her through the breathing exercises Brian taught me for panic attacks. Count to 4 on the inhale, hold for 4, exhale for 4, repeat until your heart stops racing. She stayed on the phone while I talked about random stuff like the cooking show I'd been watching and how the chef kept burning everything. Miss Rosemary got to her house after an hour, but Kiara wanted to keep talking, so we stayed on until 4 a.m. She finally fell asleep with the phone still on, and I listened to her breathing for another 20 minutes before hanging up. Miss Rosemary called me that Thursday and asked if I'd come to her grief support group at the church on Sunday. I showed up early and sat in the back row of metal folding chairs while parents filtered in carrying coffee and tissues. The leader was a woman who'd lost 2 sons to overdoses 3 years apart. Each parent stood up and talked about their kid and how they died and what they wished they'd done differently. Miss Rosemary introduced me as Jack's friend, who tried to save him, and nobody looked at me with judgment. One father shook my hand afterward and said, "At least I was there when it happened, because his daughter died alone in a motel room." The next Tuesday at NA, Brian pushed me to share for real this time, instead of just saying I was grateful to be there. I stood up and told the whole room about Jack dying on my bathroom floor and the lies I told his mother for 3 months. People nodded like they understood, and one woman said she'd done something similar with her sister. Brian caught me after the meeting and said there was a difference between taking responsibility and just feeling sorry for myself. He made me write down specific actions I was taking to make amends versus just feeling guilty about everything. The preliminary hearing date came 2 weeks later, and Whitney met me outside the courthouse at 7 a.m. The prosecutor was a tired-looking woman who seemed more interested in the dealer than in destroying my life. She mentioned my cooperation and the fact that I'd saved Kiara's life as positive factors in considering the plea deal. Whitney squeezed my shoulder when we left court and said things were looking better than expected. Detective Childress called Whitney's office the next day to confirm they'd arrested Blue on multiple trafficking charges that had nothing to do with Jack. My information would support their case, but I wouldn't have to testify in open court since they had enough other evidence. The relief hit me so hard, my knees actually buckled, and I had to sit on the courthouse steps for 10 minutes. Miss Rosemary came over that weekend to help me pack Jack's things, since I had to be out soon. Each item turned into a small conversation about memories or habits, or inside jokes only she would understand. She wanted his winter jacket because it still smelled like him, and asked for some books he'd loved as a kid. Kiara asked for his guitar, even though he never learned more than 3 chords, and always quit after 10 minutes of practice. We divided everything without any arguments, and I kept one photo of us from better times. The court paperwork arrived 3 days later in a thick manila envelope that Whitney had warned me about. 6 months of mandatory treatment at an approved facility, random drug testing twice a week at my expense, 200 hours of community service, and weekly verification of NA attendance. The list went on for 3 pages of requirements and restrictions that would control every part of my life. Whitney said it was still better than prison, and I signed everywhere she marked with yellow tabs. Miss Rosemary brought me to Kiara's family therapy session that week, where I mostly sat quietly and listened. The therapist was a soft-spoken man who talked about how addiction affects family systems and creates patterns of enabling and codependency. Kiara mentioned feeling less empty lately, but still having bad days where she wanted to disappear. Her mom held her hand the whole time, and I noticed they'd both stopped wearing long sleeves to hide their arms. Cooper knocked on my door the morning of the final walkthrough with his clipboard and measuring tape. I'd cleaned everything, including inside the oven and under the refrigerator where years of dirt had built up. The bathroom door I'd kicked in to save Kiara had been replaced with my last paycheck from the restaurant. He walked through each room making notes and checking for damage, while I followed behind, pointing out the repairs I'd made. When he got to the bedroom, he paused at the corner where Jack had punched a hole during withdrawal. I'd patched and painted it myself, watching videos on my phone. Cooper actually looked impressed and said he'd return half my deposit, which was $500 more than I expected to ever see again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and started writing a letter to Jack that I'd never send. My hand shook as I wrote about his mom forgiving me and Kiara fighting to stay clean every single day. The words came out messy and crossed out and rewritten until the page looked like my thoughts felt. At the Tuesday NA meeting, Brian asked if anyone had something to share, and I stood up without planning to. I read the letter out loud, and my voice cracked on the part about finding him on the bathroom floor. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes, and an old guy nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Brian caught my eye from across the room and gave me this small nod that meant more than any words could. 2 days later, Detective Childress showed up at my door with more questions about the timeline of Jack's fake rehab messages. I sat at my table and went through every lie I'd told, showing him the dates on my phone and explaining how I'd made up details about group therapy. He wrote everything down in his notebook and asked why I'd kept lying for so long after Jack died. I told him the truth about needing rent money and being scared of prison because of my old charges. He closed his notebook and said the case was moving forward, but they weren't focusing on me as the main target anymore. Whitney called an hour after he left and said this was better than we could have hoped for. She came to my apartment the next week to prepare me for the official plea hearing coming up. She spread papers across my table and explained that Miss Rosemary might give something called a victim impact statement. The thought of her standing up in court talking about Jack made my stomach turn. Whitney must have seen my face because she said Miss Rosemary had already told her she'd be fair, not vengeful. I asked what fair meant, and Whitney said it meant telling the truth without trying to destroy me. That Thursday at Kiara's therapy session, she mentioned the bathroom at my apartment gave her panic attacks now. She couldn't even walk past it without her heart racing and her hands getting sweaty. Miss Rosemary looked at the urn still sitting on my counter and suggested we scatter Jack's ashes somewhere peaceful. Kiara said maybe by the river where he used to fish when they were kids. We started planning something small with just the three of us, no big ceremony or speeches. 3 days before my court date, I went to Cooper's office to turn in my apartment keys early. He seemed surprised when I handed them over and said, most people wait until the last possible minute. I told him I wanted the court to see I was taking responsibility for everything. The empty keychain in my pocket felt weird, like I'd lost something important, but also gotten free from it. Cooper shook my hand when I left, which was the first time he'd ever done that in 3 years. A guy from NA named Mike heard I needed a place to stay and offered his couch for a few weeks. He lived in this sober house with a bunch of rules posted on the wall about visitors and curfews and chores. The first night I had to be back by 10 and couldn't have anyone over without permission from the house manager. After years of doing whatever I wanted, the structure actually felt good, like guardrails on a dangerous road. Brian started giving me service work at meetings like setting up chairs and making coffee before everyone arrived. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to do with my hands during the dangerous hours between work and sleep. Other people started recognizing me as the coffee guy and thanking me for having it ready. One morning, Whitney called to say Detective Childress had news about the dealer's case. He'd taken a plea deal on trafficking charges that had nothing to do with Jack's death. My statement would stay sealed in the court files and wouldn't be made public anywhere. That night I actually slept 8 hours straight without waking up, scared someone was coming for me. The next week marked Kiara's first full month in her outpatient program without missing a single session. She still had bad days where she wanted to disappear, but she kept showing up anyway. Miss Rosemary brought a chocolate cake to celebrate, and we ate it in her living room while Kiara talked about her group therapy. She said other kids there understood what it felt like to want to stop existing. The night before my plea hearing, Miss Rosemary asked if I was ready to tell the complete truth in court. I told her I'd been ready since the night she stuck that needle in my shoulder. She reached over and patted my hand like she used to do with Jack when he was nervous. I said carrying all those lies had been killing me just as much as Jack's death had. She nodded and said the truth might hurt, but lies would destroy us all eventually. The next morning I put on my only clean button-up shirt and rode the bus to the courthouse with my hands shaking the whole way. Whitney met me outside, and we went through security together before finding the right courtroom on the 3rd floor. The room was smaller than I expected, with wood panels on the walls and rows of benches like church pews behind a low barrier. Miss Rosemary and Kiara sat in the 2nd row and both nodded when I looked back at them. The judge came in, and everyone stood up while my legs felt like water underneath me. Whitney had explained everything beforehand, but hearing the prosecutor read the charges out loud made my stomach turn inside out. When the judge asked how I pleaded, my voice cracked, saying guilty to misdemeanor obstruction of justice. He looked through papers on his desk and asked about my cooperation with the investigation, and Whitney stood up to explain everything I'd done to help. The prosecutor mentioned my lack of prior violent crimes and recommended the diversion program we'd already discussed. The judge said he'd approve the agreement, but wanted to hear from the victim's family first, if they wished to speak. Miss Rosemary stood up slowly and walked to the podium at the front of the room. She told the judge I'd tried to save both her children, even while drowning in my own guilt from Jack's death. Her voice stayed steady when she said punishment should include rehabilitation and not just suffering because that wouldn't bring Jack back. She looked right at me and said she believed I could become someone worth saving if given the chance. The judge thanked her and then started listing all the requirements I'd have to complete. 6 months of verified treatment with random drug testing twice weekly, and 200 hours of community service to be completed at the county hospital. He said I'd be working in the emergency department, specifically stocking Narcan and comfort supplies for overdose victims and their families. The irony made my chest tight, but it felt like the right kind of punishment for what I'd let happen. My first shift would start the following week, and any missed hours would violate the agreement. He scheduled my first compliance check for 3 months out and said any positive drug test or missed requirement would mean immediate incarceration. After court, Whitney said this was the best outcome we could have hoped for, and I should start looking for stable housing immediately. The sober living house Brian had mentioned called me back that afternoon and said they had a bed opening up in 3 days. I took the bus there to see the place and fill out their application with references from Brian and my NA home group. The house was an old 2-story building with 8 bedrooms and strict rules posted everywhere about curfews and chores and mandatory meetings. The guy showing me around had 5 years clean and said he'd be my roommate if I got accepted. He showed me the tiny room with 2 single beds and 1 dresser we'd share and a bathroom down the hall for 4 people. The rent was cheap because it was subsidized, but they did random room searches and breathalyzer tests without warning. I signed all the paperwork and gave them what little money I had left for the deposit. 2 days later, I got a call from Javier saying he was putting me on the schedule as on-call only, which meant maybe 10 hours a week if someone called in sick. He said I'd become unreliable, and he couldn't count on me for regular shifts anymore, even though I'd only missed 2 days. I thanked him for not firing me completely and started looking for second work immediately. The all-night diner down the street from the sober house had a help wanted sign, and I walked in to apply. The manager barely looked at me when he asked if I had a record, and when I said yes, he just shrugged and said the dishwashing shift started at midnight. The pay was minimum wage, but they'd give me 5 nights a week and didn't care about my court dates as long as I showed up on time. I took it without negotiating and started that same night washing endless stacks of plates and coffee cups until 8 in the morning. My hands turned raw from the hot water and industrial soap, but the work kept my mind busy during the dangerous overnight hours when I used to get high. After 2 weeks of this schedule, Kiara called and invited me to her school meeting about making up the credits she'd missed during her crisis. I sat in the counselor's office while Kiara explained her plan to graduate on time by taking summer classes and online courses. She'd mapped out every assignment and test she needed to complete, and watching her advocate for herself showed me how far she'd come from that bathroom floor. The counselor agreed to her plan, and I signed as her support person for accountability check-ins. That same week, Miss Rosemary told me she'd joined a grief support group specifically for parents who'd lost children to overdoses. She started going alone on Tuesday nights and said it helped to hear other people's stories of guilt and anger and confusion. She reduced the food drop-offs to once a week and only cooked for special occasions now instead of trying to feed me constantly. The boundaries felt strange at first, but they helped everyone focus on their own healing instead of taking care of each other. We started planning to scatter Jack's ashes at a spot by the river where he used to fish as a kid before everything went bad. Miss Rosemary wanted something simple with just the 3 of us and no big ceremony or speeches about who he could have been. A month into my hospital community service, my supervisor pulled me aside to say she'd noticed I never missed a shift and always completed every task thoroughly. She offered to write a reference letter for the court, saying she saw potential in me to do better. I thanked her with tears running down my face because nobody had said anything positive about me in so long. At my first official court check-in 3 months after sentencing, the compliance officer went through my file page by page. Random drug tests, all negative with verified attendance at every required testing date. Community service hours on track with positive supervisor feedback included in the file. Treatment verification from both individual therapy and group sessions without any missed appointments. She stamped my paperwork and said to keep doing exactly what I'd been doing because the next review would be in another 3 months. 2 weeks later, Kiara called me crying, but not the bad kind this time. She'd made it 30 days without cutting herself and wanted someone to know besides her therapist. I met her and Miss Rosemary at the outpatient center, where Layla had helped Kiara make these index cards with stuff to do instead of hurting herself. One card said to hold ice cubes until they melted, another said to draw on her skin with red marker, and the one Miss Rosemary kept staring at said, "Call someone who loves you," with both their phone numbers written underneath. Kiara showed me the scars on her arms that were finally starting to fade and admitted the urges still came every single day, but the cards helped her wait them out. Miss Rosemary took that card home and put it in this fancy frame she bought, hanging it in their kitchen where Kiara would see it every morning. That Sunday, we finally scattered Jack's ashes at the spot by the river where he used to fish before everything went wrong. The water was calm, and nobody else was around at 6 in the morning when we got there. Miss Rosemary went first, talking about how she loved Jack even when he stole from her and lied to her face, how being his mother was the hardest and best thing she ever did. Kiara said she forgave him for leaving them alone and for making her think drugs were the answer to feeling empty inside. When my turn came, I just said I was sorry for not saving him and for lying about it after. Then we watched the gray dust float away on the current until we couldn't see it anymore. Cooper called that week saying I had 3 days to do the final walkthrough before he'd charge me for another month. I spent 12 hours scrubbing every surface in that apartment, fixing the bathroom door I'd kicked in, saving Kiara, patching nail holes, even cleaning inside the oven nobody had touched in years. When Cooper showed up, he walked through each room twice, checking behind the toilet and inside cabinets like he was looking for reasons to keep my deposit. Instead, he handed me a check for the full amount, saying he'd never seen a place this clean after someone got evicted. That money went straight to paying off my court fees that had been piling up for months. Miss Rosemary invited me to her actual house for the first time, just me and her and Kiara for dinner, without any court stuff or therapy appointments to worry about. We sat at her dining room table working through Kiara's calculus homework, and when she made this joke about imaginary numbers being less complicated than real ones, we all actually laughed for the first time since Jack died. The moment felt important somehow, like we were finally allowed to have good times again, without feeling guilty about it. Whitney needed me to write this statement for my diversion file about my commitment to the program, so I spent 3 days writing and rewriting a page about never lying to this family again, after everything they'd done for me. She read it, and said it was good to have it documented, that judges liked seeing people take responsibility in writing. The truth had gotten easier to tell than lies ever were, probably because I didn't have to remember what version I'd told to who anymore. 6 months into the program, my community service supervisor called me into her office, which usually meant trouble, but she wanted to tell me I'd completed over half my required hours without missing a single shift. My sober house roommate made pancakes for the whole house when I told them, saying recovery was built on small wins like this. The other guys living there had their own milestones to celebrate, like 1 year clean, or getting their kids back, or finding steady work, and we all cheered for each other because we knew how hard every single day was. Kiara got the letter saying she could go back to regular classes after finishing her outpatient requirements, though she still had to see Layla every week and stay in therapy. She started talking about maybe becoming a counselor someday, helping kids like her who didn't know how to deal with their feelings without hurting themselves. Her grades were good enough that she might actually get into college if she kept working this hard. The diner manager called me into the office after my shift one night, and I figured I was getting fired. But instead, he said I'd been doing good work and wanted to promote me to prep cook. Better hours, better pay, and I wouldn't smell like dish soap all the time. Javier even called that same week offering me some shifts back at the restaurant, but I turned him down because I knew I needed to stay where people actually valued my work. Having steady money felt weird after so many months of scrambling just to eat. Miss Rosemary showed up to Thursday dinner with this quiet man from her grief support group who'd lost his daughter to pills 2 years ago. She seemed nervous, asking if it was okay with us that she was dating someone, like she needed our permission to be happy again. Kiara and I told her she deserved to find good things wherever she could, and the man seemed nice enough, bringing dessert and not trying to act like anybody's dad. 9 months clean meant I qualified to be a temporary sponsor at NA meetings, helping newcomers get through their first few weeks. Brian said I was ready for it, that my story about losing Jack and almost losing everything else helped people see that recovery was possible even after making terrible mistakes. Having a purpose besides just staying clean made the guilt feel less heavy every day. Spring came faster than I expected, and suddenly it was May with Kiara, walking across the gym stage in her cap and gown, while Miss Rosemary and I stood up in the bleachers making way too much noise. The principal called her name, and she grabbed her diploma with both hands, like she was afraid someone might take it back. Miss Rosemary had tears running down her face, and kept squeezing my arm every time another kid walked across. After the ceremony, Kiara showed us her acceptance letter to the community college downtown, and said she wanted to study psychology to help kids like her. We went to the diner where I worked, and my manager let me have the night off to celebrate with them. 3 weeks later, Whitney called me into her office to prep for my court review and went through all my paperwork showing perfect attendance at NA and negative drug tests for the whole year. The judge barely looked up from his papers when he reduced my supervision to monthly check-ins and said I was on track for early termination if I kept it up. Whitney walked me out of the courthouse saying most people never make it this far without at least one slip-up. That weekend, I signed a lease on a tiny studio apartment above a bakery after saving for months in the sober house. Miss Rosemary showed up with bags of groceries while I was carrying boxes up the stairs and helped me put sheets on the mattress I'd bought from the thrift store. The place had one window and a kitchen the size of a closet, but it was mine, and I'd earned every square foot of it. Kiara started college in August and joined a recovery support group that met in the student center every Tuesday. She'd text me pictures of her psychology textbooks with parts highlighted and little notes in the margins about how the brain works during addiction. Her new friends from the group would sometimes come to Thursday dinners, and Miss Rosemary would cook enough food for an army. One girl talked about losing her brother to pills, and Kiara held her hand under the table the whole time. October brought cooler weather, and Miss Rosemary asked if her boyfriend from grief group could join us for Thanksgiving. The man showed up carrying 2 pies and shook my hand without trying to act like he knew me better than he did. We ate turkey and stuffing at Miss Rosemary's dining room table with Jack's chair still there, but pushed against the wall now. The boyfriend didn't try to fill the silence when we got quiet, thinking about who was missing. 2 weeks before Christmas, I stood in front of the judge for what Whitney said would be my last court appearance. He read through a stack of papers about my community service hours and clean drug tests and the letters from my NA sponsor and work supervisor. The prosecutor didn't object when he granted early termination of supervision and said my charges would be eligible for expungement if I stayed clean for 2 more years. Whitney actually hugged me on the courthouse steps and said she'd never seen someone work so hard to turn things around. The diner promoted me to line cook right after New Year's, and I started taking culinary classes at the vocational school 3 nights a week. My instructor was this old guy who'd run kitchens for 30 years, and he showed me how to hold a knife properly and season food by smell. He watched me prep vegetables for 20 minutes one night and said I had good hands for kitchen work if I kept practicing. The other students were mostly kids right out of high school, but they didn't treat me different even though I was older. March rolled around and Kiara had to give a presentation for her addiction and recovery class about family systems. She'd been working on it for weeks, interviewing me and her mom about how Jack's death changed everything and how we'd all found different ways to heal. The morning of her presentation, she texted me that she was nervous but ready. That afternoon, Miss Rosemary sent me a photo of Kiara standing in front of her class, holding up a paper with a big A+ written in red pen at the top. They were both smiling real smiles, not the fake ones we used to do when we were pretending everything was fine. I texted back that I'd bring dessert for dinner on Thursday, and I meant it because I'd been practicing this chocolate cake recipe from culinary class for 2 weeks. The instructor said presentation matters as much as taste, so I'd even bought one of those fancy cake carriers to bring it over in. Thursday came, and I walked into Miss Rosemary's house carrying that cake like it was made of gold, while Kiara laughed at how careful I was being with it. Well, folks, that's gonna wrap it up for today. Hope you had fun just wondering about stuff with me for a bit. Until we cross paths again, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.